Here come the drums. Welcome to the Mark Peterson Show, the podcast that brings you news, views, and parapolitics from a blackish point of view. Welcome to episode 25, entitled Stranger Things. George Floyd's murder may have been a hit. Yeah, you heard me. A hit. Let's break this down. George Floyd, a black man, his death sparked ongoing protests when Derek Chauvin, identified by local media as the officer in the videotape kneeling on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. Here's what some of you may already know. Floyd and Chauvin worked at the same nightclub, el-neuvo-rodeo, a club owned by Maya Santamaria, located in Minneapolis South Side. Both men worked security, Floyd as a bouncer and Chauvin as an outside security. And how he got to be security is an interesting tale that kind of connects the dots to how this thing may have all come together. Let's start first with breaking down the nightclub, el-neuvo rodeo. As I mentioned, the owner is Maya Santamaria. She's a singer, waitress, music promoter, and has a degree in anthropology. Shortly after opening the club back in 2006, they were pushing to close it and yank her liquor license. That's not uncommon. But let's go a little further. She was slapped with fines because she hosted more people than the fire code allowed, which again is not out of the ordinary, but she was advertising the business as a nightclub when it was only licensed as a restaurant. Because in the community where she opened, they weren't allowing nightclubs. You had to get a special permit and exception to run a nightclub. But she was advertising the restaurant as a nightclub for the Latino community because, in her own words, they needed a place to blow off some steam. She also got questioned about selling more alcohol than food, again, because her license only allowed for her to be a restaurant. She was acting more like a nightclub. Her license required that 60% of the receipts be food, and she clearly was not doing that. Again, no alarm bell so far from what you hear, but as we get deeper into the story, you'll see why some of this matters. December of that year, city officials convened to determine that el-neuvo rodeo's liquor license should not be renewed. Santamaria agreed in order to get the license to submit her food and alcohol receipts to the council. In April of 2008, that's where the stuff started to get really interesting. 3 people were shot outside the Denny's, which is right across the street from the nightclub. A local newspaper, the Longfellow Nokomis Messenger, connected the shooting to the nightclub's patrons, though the police was not able to make that connection. That's the first alarm bell you should see going off, because who worked right outside of the nightclub, parked in his car, providing security to the club? Derek Chauvin. If the Longfellow Nokomis Messenger was able to connect the dots between the patrons that were involved in the shooting and the police were not, what was he doing? Where was he at? You see, el-neuvo rodeo was required to get the extra security as one of the additional steps to get their liquor license back and to get their business license back. And so Chauvin accepted the job and worked as security outside of the club for nearly 17 years. In 17 years, you're going to learn who most of the patrons are who are going in and out of the club. You're going to notice everything that's going on the streets. You're going to see patrons leave the club and go to the Denny's across the street to get breakfast. But in the case of this shooting, Derek Chauvin could not make the connections that the local newspaper was able to make. That should be the first flag. On November 14th, 2008, there were multiple police calls associated with the nightclub. Incidents range from shots fired, an officer-involved shooting, several felony assaults on patrons and staff, numerous misdemeanors, obstructing, disorderly conduct, assault, and theft. That same month, the city compiled its case against the nightclub and had a stack of police reports. 28 reports in 2008 and 6 from 2009. The city attorney on the case described the business as having, quote-unquote, an inordinately high number of incidents of criminal behavior. Now remember, Derek Chauvin was brought in 2006 to provide security outside the club. And yet, the criminal element and criminal activity outside the club continue to escalate. I know what you're saying. You're saying, Mark, this does not prove that George Floyd's murder was a hit just because there was a high amount of crime associated with the club where he was a bouncer, where Derek Chauvin was the security in front of the club, where both men had overlapping shifts and knew each other. Doesn't prove it, right? But think about the type of crime that's happening. Shootings, assaults, thefts, officer-related shootings. This is starting to tell you that this feels like a turf war. Like rival gangs running up on each other at the club and shooting at each other. Think about your own cities and clubs and realize that in your own newspapers, they're reporting the gang activity that's occurring at some of these nightclubs. And there's a reason why they're shooting at each other, and there's a reason why it's a turf war. Because the club itself is the place where they're making their money. And this is where the plot thickens. Let's jump into Derek Chauvin. Records show that the 44-year-old Chauvin initially studied cooking before taking courses in law enforcement and doing 2 stints in the Army as a military police officer. In the 1990s, he served at Fort Benning in Georgia and then later in Germany. Chauvin became a Minnesota police officer in 2001, had 17 complaints against him, including one for pulling a woman out of her car after a speeding stop in which she was doing 10 miles over the speed limit. Interesting. He won 2 medals of valor, though I don't know why you would give them to him, because in the one instance in 2006, he was part of a group of officers who opened fire on a stabbing suspect who, quote-unquote, pointed a gun at them. In the other, in 2008, it was for domestic violence, where Chauvin broke down a bathroom door and shot the suspect in the stomach. In both cases, he was given a Medal of Valor for shooting the victim. That doesn't make him a hitman, but it does start to show you that he is capable of performing a hit. He doesn't de-escalate the situation, but can certainly escalate it and use terminal force. But that's not the key link that I want you to focus in on. Derek Chauvin was married to Kelly Chauvin, a Hmong immigrant who was the first Hmong to win the Miss Minnesota pageant. Hmongs are from Southeast Asia, typically southern China, Vietnam, or Laos. This is the key point I want you to focus in on, because two of the other officers involved in the arrest of George Floyd were Hmong, the same region in which Derek Chauvin's wife is from. And that's going to make more sense as I dig a little deeper into this case. But I want to tell you one more thing about Derek Chauvin. In 2019, he single-handedly apprehended a group of gang members while working as the off-duty security guard at el-Neuvo Rodeo. Here's why that's kind of wild. Everyone described Chauvin as a man willing to escalate the situation, use pepper spray when it wasn't needed, shoot when he didn't need to shoot. In this case, he single-handedly, without any other officer, apprehended not one, but a group of gang members, while serving as that same security officer who could not make the connection between the shootings at Denny's across the street. If you're not picking up the clues, then you're not listening. Derek Chauvin was probably involved in a gang. Or at a minimum, he was being paid by a gang to help them control the turf. The turf called el-Neuvo Rodeo, the nightclub where they probably distributed their product and the central hub of all of their illicit activity. Okay, well, I did a little bit more digging and I've tried to figure out who the gangs are in Minneapolis. And one of the biggest gangs is a Hmong gang called Menace-of-Destruction, MOD, formerly known as Masters of Destruction. Hmong gangs were created in 1988, and today they are active in every state with a large Hmong community, including California and the Midwestern United States, including Minnesota, with a large contingent in Minneapolis. Hmong gangs are known for prostitution, money laundering, distributing of narcotics, and according to the DEA, they are also known for counterfeiting. Counterfeiting goods, products, and money. It's starting to come together now, right? It's starting to make a little more sense to you. Guys, I didn't stop digging there. Here's what else I found out. A national drug ring based in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul was busted in 2012. They were linked to the cartel La Familia out of Mexico, and they were smuggling in millions of dollars of methamphetamine from Mexico to the Twin Cities area and then distributed out into Minnesota. The drugs went through a local member of the cartel and then distributed to, yes, you got it, the Menace-of-Destruction gang, the Hmong gang that I just mentioned. Oh, and by the way, what is La Familia also known for? Counterfeiting. Here's what you need to know about methamphetamine. It's no longer made by cooks in makeshift labs in people's neighborhoods in houses like you saw in Breaking Bad. According to the DEA, it has become the preferred drug of Mexican cartels. Because of the pressure that has been put on the opiates, they've switched over to methamphetamines. And they are mass producing high quality quantities of the drug and pushing it into markets where they had previously not pushed any product, including the Northeast. I read a white paper on the distribution of methamphetamines, and all of these sources are going to be in the show notes. I don't want you to think that I'm just sitting here rattling things off. I did the research. I want you to go back and repeat the research and see if you see the threads that I'm pulling on. Now, methamphetamine, according to the DEA, is a street drug in many parts of the country. But in the Northeast, methamphetamine functions as a quote-unquote club drug. And here's what their report says. Quote, Methamphetamine use has been found in a range of club subcultures, including electronic dance music club, raves, and circuit parties. Now, I want you to go to Google and put in El Nuevo Rodeo and look at the description of the nightclub. It fits the bill for what is described here by the DEA. So remember now, Chauvin shows up to arrest George Floyd with two other individuals from the Hmong community after being told that he was passing off a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase a pack of cigarettes. 11-year veteran and native Hmong speaker Tao Tho was one of the officers on the scene, and he is the subject of 6 complaints compared to Derek Chauvin, who had 17. Both officers, for their tenure, have an abnormally high number of complaints against them. These guys weren't operating as officers. They were operating as members of this Hmong gang. I dug a little deeper, and you will see the link in the show notes, where the DEA lists out the occupations that gang members have when they're not working for the gang. And the menance-of-destruction's primary occupations include military and law enforcement when they're not doing work for the gang. These guys are smart. They're just like corporations who put their people in government and then bring them back to the corporation, cross-pollinating it so they make sure they win all the contracts. These guys are doing the same thing. So it would make sense that menance-of-destruction would have officers who were gang members to give them the inside track, to help them make sure they maintain their muscle in the areas where they want to distribute their product. Remember, they had links to Mexican drug cartels, La Familia, the methamphetamines that flow from Mexico into Minneapolis, and both groups were known for counterfeiting products and money. So when George Floyd was arrested on May 25th, 2020, the video showed that Chauvin was holding his knee to his neck, while Lane was holding Floyd's legs and Keong was holding his back, while Tao, the officer with the 6 complaints, stood between the officers and onlookers, according to charging documents. Individuals have already questioned why you arrest him, put him in the car, and then take him out of the car, pin him to the ground, put your knee on his neck, hold his legs, and hold his back down, while the 4th officer keeps the crowd at a safe distance. This wasn't an arrest. I think this was a hit, because George Floyd was going to expose not just the methamphetamine ring, which had just been busted in 2012, but he was going to expose evidence of a counterfeiting ring that is probably linked to menance-of-destruction and La Familia. There's something else really stinky about what's going on in Minnesota. There's a link in the show notes to an article where law enforcement is complaining about the state's district attorney and his unwillingness to prosecute gangs. In fact, many of the judges in Minnesota are complaining about the DA's unwillingness to prosecute gangs, including one judge who lost his daughter to opiate addiction. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a book called Killing Uncle Sam. For those of you who are serious about this topic, you should read this book, because it explains how the CIA is using these sorts of clubs, gangs, and drug routes to finance its private wars all around the world. And that when one area dries up, be it the opiates, they find another avenue and another drug and another route to pipe their product and to get the money they need to finance these wars. Now, all of this started with Dulles way back with OSS and their attempts to finance private wars after World War II. And guess where the drugs came from that Dulles used to finance his private wars back then? Yeah, the Hmong community, Southeast Asia. And so those drugs then were piped into black communities via jazz clubs, believe it or not, and started an addiction and drug culture that has ruined the black community. That's not me saying it. That's what's laid out by Paul Williams in Killing Uncle Sam. In Paul Williams' book, he outlines how routes were carved through the South and that drugs were run all the way up through Mena, Arkansas, where it was piped into the Northeast. And that many times the shipments of drugs were protected by local law enforcement. You can't make these things up. Do I expect the media to do this kind of research on this case? No. Do I expect the investigators to do this kind of research? No. Because just like the JFK killing, they have their man. They have something that appeases the public, and they're going to end that case right where we see it, with a group of officers and one dead black man. But as you can see, there are many more layers to this case. Layers that I don't think anyone wants to peel back and discover America's seemly underbelly. I hope many of you take the time to go through the show notes. I hope many of you take the time to step back and ask yourself the obvious questions. These two men knew each other. They worked with each other for over a year, both in security. There's no way a bouncer would not have had to throw someone out the club and come across the security working right outside the front door. What caused this action, in my opinion, was some of the activity that went on in that club found its way into Floyd's hand. A counterfeit $20 bill. And the only reason an officer would escalate that to the point of wanting to execute a man, despite the pleas that he was making, in front of the public, who all had cell phones and could record the incident, is that he intended for this man to die and intended for the link to the evidence that this man may have represented to die with him. That's what I'm alleging. But I want you to do the homework. I want you to go through the articles and see the threads that are woven through this incident. A club located near the Third Precinct where Chauvin worked, with a sketchy history, with lots of gunfire, with officer-related shootings, none of which could be linked back to the club where Chauvin worked, outside the club. He was protecting that turf because he may have been involved in the activity that was going on inside that club and linked to the hmong gangs that are distributing narcotics and counterfeit bills in the Twin Cities area. Guys, I'm hearing these drums. I appreciate you listening. I want you to do the research because there's more beneath the surface than what we're being told. If you like this show, you may like my paranormal show called Event Horizon. That's the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Follow us on Twitter at Peterson the, No, I could not get the Peterson show, if you believe it or not. There's like 1 million Mark Petersons. So follow us on Peterson the on Twitter, and let's keep this conversation going. Till next time, guys, peace.
Hey you, podcast listener, this is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. Take the blue pill. You wake up in your bed and go back to listening to mundane podcasts that won't challenge your religious beliefs and your so-called truths about reality, the universe, and consciousness. Take the red pill. Subscribe to the Event Horizon podcast, hosted by Mark Anthony Peterson, and he will show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Event Horizon takes a walk into the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. It's the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Subscribe to the Event Horizon podcast by Mark Anthony Peterson on Spreaker, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Stitcher, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Remember, all we are offering is the truth, nothing more.